The morning of October 7th, 1944, near the French town of Arras, Sergeant Bill Morrison watched a German Panther tank emerge from the tree line 800 yards ahead. His Sherman's bow gunner whispered a prayer. The loader froze with his hand on a 75mm round. Every tanker in Third Army knew what happened when you faced a Panther head-on. The German 75mm high-velocity gun could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The Sherman's gun needed to be within 500 yards and praying for a lucky shot at weak points. Morrison's hand moved to the intercom switch, but instead of ordering his gunner to fire, he did something that contradicted every instinct, every training manual, every tactical doctrine drilled into American tank crews since North Africa. He told his driver to throw the transmission into reverse and back directly toward the German gun. The driver's voice cracked over. The intercom. "Sarge, you said reverse?" Morrison's reply was calm, almost casual. "You heard me. Reverse. Now. And don't stop until I tell you." The Sherman lurched backward, tracks churning mud as the 33-ton vehicle accelerated in reverse at nearly 12 miles per hour. The Panther's commander must have thought the Americans were retreating, because the German tank pivoted slightly, preparing to pursue and finish the kill. That pivot gave Morrison exactly what he needed. The Panther's side armor, thinner and more vulnerable than its frontal plate, came into view for exactly 4 seconds. Morrison's gunner didn't need to be told twice. The Sherman's 75mm gun roared. The round struck the Panther's side armor just below the turret ring. Secondary explosions bloomed orange as ammunition cooked off inside the German tank. Morrison's Sherman was still rolling backward when the Panther died. His crew sat in stunned silence for 3 seconds, then erupted in. Nervous laughter that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with not being dead. What Morrison had just executed wasn't improvisation or panic. It was a tactic that American tank crews were discovering through brutal trial and error across France in fall 1944. A tactic so counterintuitive that it violated every human instinct about facing danger, yet so effective that it was turning lopsided armor matchups into survivable engagements. Reversing into enemy fire shouldn't work. Everything about it seems wrong. You're presenting your weakest armor, the Sherman's rear hull, toward an enemy gun that can penetrate anything you have. You're limiting your own visibility because tank periscopes and vision ports face forward, not backward. You're reducing your speed because tanks accelerate slower in reverse than forward. You're trusting your life to a driver who's steering blind using only verbal commands from the tank commander. But crews like Morrison's were surviving encounters with German armor that should have killed them, and the secret wasn't thicker steel or bigger guns. It was geometry, psychology, and the willingness to do something that felt suicidal. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By October 1944, American tank crews in Europe were facing a crisis of confidence that bordered on existential terror. The Sherman tank that had performed adequately in North Africa and Sicily was being systematically outclassed by German armor in France. The numbers were devastating and impossible to ignore. When Third Army's 4th Armored Division engaged German forces near Arras between September 18th and 29th, 1944, they documented 262 tank versus tank engagements. American tankers reported that in head-to-head frontal encounters at ranges between 800 and 1,500 yards, German Panthers and Tigers achieved first-shot kills on Sherman's roughly 78% of the time. Sherman crews engaging the same German tanks from frontal positions achieved first-shot kills only 11% of the time. The mathematics were clear and brutal. In a fair fight, German armor won 7 out of 10 times. The problem wasn't crew training or tactical doctrine. It was physics and metallurgy. The Panther's frontal armor measured 80 millimeters thick, sloped at 55 degrees from vertical, creating an effective thickness exceeding 140 millimeters against perpendicular shots. The Sherman's frontal hull armor was 51 millimeters thick at a nearly vertical 56 degrees from horizontal, providing minimal deflection benefit. The German 75mm K-42 L-70 gun on the Panther could penetrate 140mm of vertical armor at 1,000 yards. The Sherman's 51mm plate didn't require the German gun's full capability. It was like bringing a rain jacket to stop a rifle bullet. Worse, German tank guns outranged American weapons by factors that made engagement geometry almost irrelevant. A Panther could sit at 1,800 yards, comfortably outside the effective range of a Sherman 75mm gun, and methodically destroy American tanks that couldn't shoot back accurately. Field reports from 1st Army units in the Hürtgen Forest documented Panthers knocking out Shermans at ranges exceeding 2,200 yards, distances where American crews couldn't even identify the target clearly through their optics. The Tiger was even more nightmarish. 56 tons of armor wrapped around an 88mm gun that could penetrate 180mm of steel at 1,000 yards. The Tiger's frontal armor measured 100mm thick, effectively impenetrable to the Sherman's 75mm gun at any realistic combat range. American crews who encountered Tigers had three options: call for air support, call for tank destroyers with heavier guns, or die trying to close to ranges where a lucky shot might penetrate side or rear armor. None of these options were reliable. Air support took time American tankers didn't have when a Tiger appeared. Tank destroyers weren't always available in the right place at the right moment, and closing to within 500 yards of a Tiger meant crossing kill zones where the German gun could engage with perfect accuracy. By September 1944, replacement tank crews arriving in Europe from training centers in the States were hearing horror stories that contradicted everything their instructors had told them. Veterans described watching Panthers destroy entire platoons of Shermans in minutes. They talked about 88mm shells that didn't just penetrate Sherman armor, but passed completely through, entering the front hull and exiting the rear, killing everyone inside and often continuing onward to damage vehicles behind the initial target. The psychological impact was devastating. Crew morale plummeted. Some tankers began exhibiting symptoms of combat stress before even seeing action: anxiety attacks, sleeplessness, physical tremors when climbing into their tanks. Officers documented cases of experienced crews refusing to advance when German armor was reported ahead. Not cowardice, just rational mathematics. They'd calculated their odds and decided that courage couldn't overcome physics. The Army knew it had a crisis that threatened operational effectiveness. If tank crews lost faith in their vehicles, entire armored divisions could lose their offensive capability. Patton's Third Army depended on aggressive armored thrusts to exploit breakthroughs. If Sherman crews started hesitating or refusing to engage German armor, the entire operational tempo would collapse. But here's what the crisis revealed. When conventional advantages disappear, when you can't outgun or out-armor your opponent, soldiers start innovating. They start questioning assumptions that seemed unbreakable. They start asking dangerous questions like, what if we're fighting this wrong? What if the solution isn't better armor or bigger guns? What if it's changing how we use what we have? The idea that became reverse engagement tactics emerged from desperation, observation, and the kind of lateral thinking that only happens when people are trying not to die. The principle wasn't invented in a classroom or a training manual. It was discovered by crews who ran the numbers and realized that surviving wasn't about winning fair fights. It was about never fighting fair in the first place. The realization started with basic geometry that any tanker could observe. German tanks had incredible frontal armor, but their side and rear armor was substantially thinner. A Panther's frontal plate was 80mm thick, but its side armor measured only 40 to 50mm depending on the location, and its rear armor was often only 40mm. Those thinner plates were within the penetration capability of the Sherman's 75mm gun at ranges under 800 yards. The Tiger's frontal armor measured 100mm, but its side armor was 80mm, and rear armor dropped to 82mm. Still formidable, but not invincible. A Sherman's 75mm gun firing M61 armor-piercing capped rounds could penetrate 80mm of vertical armor at 500 yards. Not reliably, not every time, but enough to make it worth trying. The problem was getting shots at side or rear armor. German tank doctrine emphasized frontal engagements where their armor advantage was decisive. Panther and Tiger commanders were trained to position their vehicles hull down behind cover, with only the turret and frontal hull exposed, presenting the thickest armor to American guns while denying flanking opportunities. Trying to maneuver around a German tank's flanks was theoretically sound, but practically suicidal. It required exposing your vehicle to the German gun while you repositioned, and German gunners were professionally trained and devastatingly accurate. Field reports documented Panthers rotating their turrets at roughly 20 degrees per second, fast enough to track a maneuvering Sherman and fire before the American tank could reach a flanking position. So American crews started asking a different question. Instead of trying to move around the German tank's position, what if you forced the German tank to move? What if you manipulated the enemy into exposing their weaker armor by making them think they had an advantage? This required understanding German tactical psychology. Panther and Tiger crews were aggressive when they believed they had the upper hand. If they saw an American tank retreating, their doctrine encouraged pursuit and destruction before the enemy could escape or call for support. German armor training emphasized aggressive exploitation of advantages, finishing wounded enemies quickly, not letting targets disengage. That aggression could be weaponized. If a Sherman appeared to be retreating, reversing away from contact, German commanders would often advance to maintain pressure and secure the kill. That advance required the German tank to move from its prepared position, to shift angles, to potentially expose side armor as it pivoted to pursue. The tactic required perfect timing and nerves that most people don't possess. The Sherman commander had to identify the German tank first, before the German crew spotted them. This meant using terrain, vegetation, buildings, anything that provided concealment to observe without being seen. Patience was torture. Every instinct screamed to shoot first or run immediately, but firing prematurely from a bad angle just announced your position and invited death. Running too early meant the German tank stayed in position, and you'd have to face it again later. The ideal sequence looked like choreographed insanity. The Sherman would appear at the edge of the German tank's field of view, fire one shot, deliberately missing or hitting at an angle that wouldn't penetrate, just enough to get the German crew's attention. Then immediately reverse, making it look like the Sherman was panicking and retreating. The German commander, seeing an American tank backing away, would often order his driver to advance, rotating slightly to bring the main gun to bear for a killing shot while pursuing. That rotation, that shift in angle as the German tank moved from a static position to a pursuit posture, created split-second windows where side armor became exposed at ranges where a Sherman's gun could penetrate. The Sherman crew, still reversing, would be watching through periscopes and the gunner's sight. The instant side armor appeared, usually just a few degrees of angle. The gunner fired for real. If the shot connected with the German tank's side or rear, penetration was likely. If the German tank was moving when hit, it often couldn't return accurate fire immediately. And if the German crew realized they'd been baited into a trap, they'd often halt or reverse themselves, breaking off the engagement rather than risk additional exposure. This wasn't guaranteed. It worked maybe 4 times out of 10 when executed perfectly, which was still infinitely better than 0 times out of 10 in frontal slugging matches. And critically, even when it didn't result in a kill, it usually resulted in survival. The German tank would break off, reassess, reposition. Those extra seconds let the Sherman crew disengage completely, fall back to supporting infantry, call for reinforcements, or reposition for a better engagement later. But executing this tactic required skills that weren't in any training, manual. The driver had to steer blind in reverse at speeds approaching 12 miles per hour, guided only by the tank commander's verbal instructions. One wrong command, one misunderstood direction, and the Sherman could reverse into a ditch, a tree, another vehicle, anything that would immobilize it and make it a stationary target. The tank commander had to watch the German tank while simultaneously directing the driver, monitoring terrain behind them, and coordinating with the gunner. It was like playing three-dimensional chess while someone was shooting at you with an 88mm gun. The gunner had to keep his sight trained on the target while the entire tank was moving backward, compensating for motion, vibration, and the knowledge that if he missed his shot, everyone was probably going to die. The loader had to keep ammunition ready while bracing against sudden stops and direction changes. And everyone had to trust that the tank commander knew what he was doing, that this insane-looking maneuver was actually a tactic and not panic. The first documented use of reverse engagement tactics appeared in after-action reports from the 2nd Armoured Division's operations near Virey, France, in early August 1944. Captain James Burt's Company B encountered 3 Panthers occupying prepared positions along a ridgeline. Frontal assault would have been suicide. Burt's platoon leaders reported trying something unconventional. They approached to within 1,000 yards, fired several ranging shots that deliberately fell short, then reversed rapidly. 2 of the 3 Panther commanders took the bait, advancing from their positions to pursue what appeared to be retreating Americans. As the Panthers crested the ridge and began descending the slope, their lower hull armour and side plates became exposed at angles that hadn't been visible when they were hull down. Burt's Shermans, still reversing but now with clear shots at vulnerable armour, engaged, and knocked out both pursuing Panthers. The 3rd Panther, whose commander chose not to pursue, remained in position and eventually withdrew when American infantry began flanking the ridge. Burt's after-action report described the tactic as reverse-bounding engagement and noted that it allowed lighter American tanks to manipulate enemy positioning through false retreat. He recommended further experimentation and formal doctrine development. His report reached 3rd Army headquarters in late August 1944, where it joined dozens of other field reports describing unconventional tactics crews were developing to survive against superior German armour. What made reverse engagement tactics spread wasn't official doctrine or training programs, it was survival. Crews talked to each other. Veterans showed replacements the techniques that had kept them alive. Tank commanders shared observations during maintenance halts and unit briefings. The tactics spread through the informal, a network that exists in every combat unit, the veteran sergeants and experienced lieutenants who taught new crews the things that actually mattered, as opposed to what was in the manual. By October 1944, when 3rd Army was grinding through Lorraine toward the German border, reverse engagement tactics had become common enough that German intelligence reports began documenting American tanks employing unusual withdrawal maneuvers that appeared designed to draw pursuit. German tactical bulletins warned crews to be cautious when American tanks appeared to retreat, noting that some apparent withdrawals were deliberate baiting tactics meant to expose side armour. But even German awareness couldn't fully counter the tactic because it exploited fundamental human psychology. When you see an enemy retreating, aggression feels correct, caution feels cowardly. German crews were trained to be aggressive, to press advantages, to destroy wounded enemies before they could escape. Overriding that training required recognizing in real time that a retreat might be fake, and making that recognition while shells were impacting around your tank was nearly impossible. The Aracourt battles in September 1944 became the proving ground where reverse engagement tactics evolved from experimental to standard practice. The terrain around Aracourt was rolling farmland with gentle hills that provided perfect conditions for the tactic. Sherman crews could position themselves on reverse slopes, hidden from direct observation, with only their tank commanders' heads exposed to scan for targets. When German tanks appeared, American crews would reverse further down the slope, creating the illusion of retreat, while actually moving to positions where the slope angle would give them shots at lower hull armour when German tanks crested the hill in pursuit. The 4th Armoured Division's after-action report from Aracourt specifically credited reverse slope defensive tactics with mobile counter-engagement for achieving kill ratios exceeding 3-to-1 against numerically superior German armour forces. Between September 18th and 29th, 4th Armoured Division claimed 281 German tank and assault gun kills for the loss of 91 American tanks. Approximately 130 of those German kills were attributed to engagements where American crews used reverse movement to manipulate German positioning before firing. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole from 3rd Armored Division's 32nd Armor Regiment became something of a legend for his execution of reverse engagement tactics. Between June and September 1944, Poole's Sherman crew was credited with 12 confirmed tank kills, 9 of them Panthers or assault guns with superior frontal armor. Poole's technique, documented in unit histories, involved approaching German positions deliberately to draw fire, reversing while the German crew was reloading, then firing at the moment when German tanks adjusted their position to track his movement. Poole survived until September 19, 1944, when his Sherman was finally knocked out near Münchweiler, Germany. He lived, though severely wounded, and his techniques were studied by armoured school instructors after the war. But not every crew could execute the tactics successfully. It required vehicle commanders with excellent spatial awareness, drivers with exceptional skill, and gunners with the ability to engage moving targets while their own platform was moving. Crews that tried reverse engagement without proper coordination often reversed into obstacles, crashed into friendly vehicles, or simply got shot because their timing was wrong. The failure rate was high enough that some unit commanders discouraged the tactic, preferring conventional doctrine even if conventional doctrine meant higher casualties. The debate over whether reverse engagement tactics were brilliant innovation or dangerous improvisation continued through the end of the war. The engineering reality of reversing a Sherman tank at combat speeds was far more complex than simply putting the transmission in reverse and backing up. The M4 Sherman used a complicated mechanical system that made reverse operations fundamentally different from forward movement, and understanding those differences meant the difference between executing the tactic successfully or dying in a disabled tank. The Sherman's transmission was a synchromesh 5-speed manual system for forward gears, but only a single-speed reverse. Forward, a skilled driver could shift through gears to optimize acceleration, speed, and engine power for different terrain and tactical situations. In reverse, there was no such flexibility. You got one gear ratio, and it delivered approximately 11 to 12 miles per hour maximum speed on level ground, slower on inclines or rough terrain. That single reverse gear created a critical limitation. When reversing, the driver couldn't downshift for more torque when encountering obstacles or uphill slopes. If the terrain required more power than the reverse gear could deliver, the tank simply lost momentum and stalled. This meant crews had to pre-scout their reverse routes obsessively, identifying and memorizing any terrain features that might bog them down during the critical seconds when they were executing the tactic. The driver's visibility in reverse was virtually non-existent. The Sherman's driver position included a forward-facing periscope and small vision ports that provided adequate forward visibility, but nothing facing rearward. Reversing meant steering completely blind, relying entirely on verbal commands from the tank commander who was watching the terrain behind them while simultaneously monitoring the enemy threat ahead. The coordination required was extraordinary. The tank commander would call directions over the intercom. Driver, reverse. Straight back. Steady. Steady. 10 degrees left. Steady. Watch for the ditch at 50 yards. Steady. 5 degrees right. Keep your speed up. The driver had to translate those commands into smooth steering inputs without visual confirmation, feeling the tank's response through the controls and engine vibration, making constant micro-adjustments to keep the vehicle on course. Any miscommunication, any unclear command or misunderstood direction could result in the Sherman reversing into terrain that immobilized it. A ditch that caught the tracks, a boulder that jammed the suspension, soft ground that bogged the vehicle down. Once immobilized, a Sherman became a stationary target, and stationary targets facing German 88mm guns did not survive. The Sherman's center of gravity created additional complications in reverse. The engine was mounted in the rear, making the back of the tank heavier than the front. When reversing up an incline, that weight distribution actually 40 side peef helped, giving the rear tracks better traction. But when reversing down an incline, the weight shifted forward, reducing rear track traction and increasing the risk of sliding or losing steering control. Experienced drivers learned to modulate throttle carefully on downslopes, using engine braking to control speed rather than relying on brakes that could lock the tracks and cause dangerous skids. The suspension system added another variable. The Sherman used a vertical volute spring suspension, or VVSS, with relatively limited travel compared to German torsion bar suspensions. On rough terrain, this meant the Sherman bounced and pitched more dramatically, especially in reverse when the driver couldn't anticipate obstacles and preemptively adjust speed. Those suspension impacts transmitted directly to the gun system. The 75mm main gun was stabilized in elevation by a gyroscope system that helped gunners maintain aim while moving, but the stabilization was crude by modern standards and worked better during forward movement than reverse. When the tank pitched violently over rough terrain in reverse, the gun elevated and depressed wildly, and the gunner had to manually compensate, fighting the stabilizer to keep the sight picture on target. This meant firing accurately, while reversing required the driver to maintain the smoothest possible path, the gunner to anticipate and correct for suspension movements, and the tank commander to time the firing command for moments when the vehicle was relatively stable. All of this while under fire from weapons that could kill them instantly. The track tensioning mattered more in reverse than forward. Sherman tracks were tensioned by adjustable idler wheels at the front of the vehicle. Properly tensioned tracks allowed smooth power transmission from the drive sprockets to the ground, but tracks that were slightly loose, still functional for forward movement, could slip on the drive sprockets during reverse, especially under heavy acceleration or on slippery surfaces. A track that slipped even momentarily meant lost momentum and potentially a stalled engine at exactly the wrong moment. Maintenance crews learned to keep tracks tensioned tighter on tanks whose commanders employed reverse engagement tactics regularly, even though tighter tension increased track and sprocket wear. The engine cooling system created a dangerous vulnerability during extended reverse operations. The Sherman's radial engine generated tremendous heat, and the cooling system was designed for forward movement, where airflow through the engine compartment was maximized. In reverse, especially at high speeds, airflow patterns changed, reducing cooling efficiency. Crews executing multiple reverse engagements in quick succession, backing up several hundred yards, repositioning, backing up again, reported engine temperature warnings after 15 to 20 minutes of intensive reverse maneuvering. Overheating meant reduced power, increased risk of engine failure, and potentially catastrophic fires if coolant lines failed. The transmission itself was not designed for sustained high-speed reverse operation. Forward gears had synchronizers that smoothed shifts and reduced wear. The single reverse gear was essentially a straight-cut gear set that transmitted tremendous stress through the transmission housing. Extended reverse operations at maximum speed generated heat in the transmission that could warp gears, damage bearings, and eventually cause complete transmission failure. Maintenance reports from Third Army units that employed reverse engagement tactics heavily documented, transmission failures occurring 30 to 40% more frequently than in units that used conventional forward-oriented tactics. Replacement transmissions were constantly in short supply, and some commanders restricted use of reverse tactics specifically to preserve mechanical reliability. Despite all these limitations, crews who mastered reverse operations gained capabilities that German tank crews, ironically, often lacked. German tanks like the Panther and Tiger had more powerful engines and theoretically better reverse speeds, but German doctrine didn't emphasize reverse maneuvers. German crews trained extensively on forward operations, on aggressive advance, and frontal engagement. American crews, forced by circumstances to innovate, became specialists in a dimension of tank combat that German training largely ignored. This created situations where technically superior German tanks were outmaneuvered by technically inferior American tanks, simply because American crews had skills German crews had never practiced. A Panther could reverse faster than a Sherman in theory, but if the Panther commander had never trained his driver to reverse blind using verbal commands, that theoretical advantage meant nothing. The human element, the coordination between commander and driver, became more important than the mechanical specifications. The best American tank crews developed almost telepathic communication. Veteran drivers learned to interpret their commander's verbal commands so instinctively that they could execute complex reverse maneuvers while monitoring engine sounds, transmission response, and track traction, making micro-adjustments faster than conscious thought could process. That level of crew coordination couldn't be taught in training schools. It developed through repeated experience, through hours of practice and combat that either killed crews who couldn't adapt or forged survivors into teams that operated their Shermans like extensions of their own bodies. By December 1944, when the Battle of the Bulge erupted, veteran American tank crews had skills that were effectively invisible on any technical specification sheet, but made all the difference in actual combat. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16, 1944, with the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940. 3 German armies, 30 divisions, over 400,000 men, and more than 1,300 tanks and assault guns smashed into American positions across an 80-mile front in the Ardennes forest. The German plan was ambitious: break through to Antwerp, split Allied forces, and force a negotiated peace before American industrial might made German defeat inevitable. For American tank crews, the Bulge was everything they'd feared compressed into 3 weeks of hell. German armour included not just Panthers and Tigers, but also the new King Tiger, 70 tons of steel with frontal armour exceeding 180 millimeters thick, effectively impervious to anything the Sherman could fire. The terrain was nightmare conditions: snow-covered forests with limited visibility, icy roads that made manoeuvring treacherous, and narrow corridors where reverse engagement tactics had minimal room to operate. Third Army's 4th Armoured Division, veterans of the Lorraine campaign and masters of reverse engagement tactics, found themselves fighting battles that seemed designed to negate everything they'd learned. On December 22, 1944, near the Belgian town of Bougainville, a company of 15 Shermans from the 37th Tank Battalion encountered elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, including 5 Panthers and 2 King Tigers, advancing down a narrow valley road. The American company commander, Captain Harold Cohen, recognized immediately that conventional tactics were impossible. The valley was too narrow for flanking maneuvers. The snow was too deep for off-road movement. Frontal engagement would be suicide against King Tiger armor, so Cohen ordered something that his crew thought was a death sentence. He told his lead platoon to reverse down the valley road directly away from the advancing German armor. The Germans, seeing American tanks reversing in what appeared to be panicked retreat, advanced aggressively down the valley. But Cohen had positioned his 2 trailing platoons on slight rises overlooking the road, concealed by tree lines. As the German armor advanced past those positions, pursuing the reversing American tanks, they exposed their side armor to the concealed Shermans. The ambush lasted 4 minutes. The concealed Shermans knocked out 3 Panthers and damaged 1 King Tiger severely enough that its crew abandoned it. The surviving German armor reversed back up the valley, breaking contact. Cohen's lead platoon stopped reversing and repositioned. The tactic had worked, but Cohen's after-action report noted that it only succeeded because the terrain confined the German advance to a predictable path. In open terrain, the same tactic might have resulted in German tanks flanking his concealed positions and destroying them. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Not every engagement during the Bulge allowed for such careful setup. Staff Sergeant Bob Early from the 10th Armoured Division's 20th Tank Battalion found himself in a running battle near the town of Ettelbruck on December 23, 1944. His platoon of 4 Shermans was covering a withdrawal of American infantry when they encountered 2 King Tigers blocking the road. Early knew his 75mm gun couldn't penetrate a King Tiger frontally at any range. He ordered his platoon to reverse while maintaining fire, not aiming for kills, but for distraction, keeping the German crews buttoned up and unable to use their vision ports effectively. His Shermans reversed nearly 2 miles down the road, firing continuously, buying time for the infantry to withdraw. The King Tigers pursued initially, but slowed when Early's gunners started hitting track guards and vision ports, degrading the German crew's ability to see and maneuver. Eventually, the King Tigers halted rather than risk continued damage or a potential ambush. Early's platoon escaped intact, though they'd expended nearly all their ammunition without achieving any kills. His after-action report described the engagement as survival through harassment and reverse movement, noting that while they hadn't destroyed the German tanks, they'd accomplished the mission of delaying enemy advance and preserving American forces. Strategic success without tactical victory, enabled entirely by the willingness to reverse away from enemies that couldn't be defeated head-on. The psychological impact on German crews was documented in captured intelligence reports from January 1945. German tank commanders reported increased caution when encountering American armor that appeared to be retreating, describing American tactics as unorthodox and designed to lure pursuit into prepared ambushes. Some German units issued orders discouraging aggressive pursuit of withdrawing American tanks unless infantry support was immediately available to prevent flanking attacks. This caution, ironically, gave American crews another advantage. If German commanders hesitated to pursue apparently retreating Shermans, American tanks could disengage from unfavorable situations more easily. The tactic had created a psychological dynamic where German technical superiority was being partially negated by tactical uncertainty. German crews knew they had better armor and guns, but they weren't sure when an American retreat was genuine or a trap, and that uncertainty slowed their operations. The cost of these tactics wasn't just mechanical wear on transmissions and tracks. It was psychological stress on crews who had to suppress every survival instinct that said run away from danger, not toward it. Reversing toward an 88mm gun while pretending to retreat required a level of composure that bordered on inhuman. Crew reports documented stress casualties, men who simply couldn't execute the tactic anymore because their nerves were destroyed. One tank commander from the 2nd Armoured Division reported in his diary that after his 4th reverse engagement, his hands shook so badly he couldn't light a cigarette. Another described nightmares where he was reversing and the driver couldn't understand his commands, steering them into ditches while German shells closed in. The tactic worked, but it extracted a psychological toll that standard combat statistics didn't capture. By January 1945, as German forces retreated from the Bulge salient, American tank doctrine had evolved to formally incorporate reverse engagement tactics in field manuals. The February 1945 edition of Field Manual 3-18, Tank Platoon, included a new section titled Withdrawal Under Fire and Reverse Engagement Techniques. The manual described proper procedures for executing reverse movements while maintaining offensive capability, including diagrams showing optimal positioning for overwatch elements while lead elements conducted reverse movements. The tactic that had started as desperate improvisation was now official doctrine, but the manual also included extensive warnings about when not to use reverse tactics: terrain with limited rear visibility, situations without supporting elements to exploit exposed enemy armor, mechanical conditions where transmission or engine reliability was questionable. The manual emphasized that reverse engagement was a specialized technique for specific situations, not a universal solution. Used incorrectly, it would get crews killed as surely as frontal charges against superior armor. The long-term impact of reverse engagement tactics extended far beyond World War II. When the US Army developed its post-war armor doctrine, the ability to fight effectively while moving in reverse became a fundamental skill that all tank crews were required to master. The M46 Patton tank, introduced in 1949, featured improved reverse speed and better driver visibility, specifically to enable reverse engagement capabilities. The M48 and M60 tanks that followed included more sophisticated reverse gear systems with multiple reverse speeds, addressing the single-gear limitation that had constrained Sherman crews. Soviet tank design evolved differently but toward similar conclusions. The T-54 and T-55 tanks introduced in the 1950s featured better reverse speeds than their World War II predecessors, though Soviet doctrine still emphasized forward aggression over reverse maneuvers. However, Soviet training manuals from the 1960s included sections on retrograde engagement techniques, suggesting that lessons from German encounters with American reverse tactics had influenced Soviet thinking about how lighter tanks could survive against heavier opponents. The Israeli Defense Forces, operating modified Shermans into the 1960s and early 1970s, became masters of reverse engagement tactics during the wars of 1956, 1967, and 1973. Israeli Sherman crews, facing more modern Soviet-supplied Arab armor, used many of the same techniques American crews had pioneered in 1944. Reverse to bait aggression, fire at exposed side armor, disengage before return fire arrived. The tactics proved effective across decades and different opponents, validating the fundamental principles. Modern main battle tanks like the M1 Abrams incorporate reverse speeds approaching 40 miles per hour, nearly 4 times what a Sherman could manage. That capability exists directly because of lessons learned when American tankers discovered that surviving superior opponents required fighting unconventionally. The Abrams' ability to rapidly reverse from positions, what modern doctrine calls battle position taitru, is a direct descendant of technofighting, techniques developed by desperate Sherman crews in France and Belgium. The psychological principle behind reverse engagement tactics: manipulate enemy behavior by appearing weak, then exploit the enemy's response, became fundamental to modern armored warfare. Soviet doctrine called it maskirovka when applied broadly to military deception. NATO doctrine termed it tactical deception through feigned withdrawal. The principle is identical. Make the enemy think they have an advantage, then use their aggression against them. Anti-tank missile teams in every modern military train using reverse engagement principles. Fire from a position, then immediately displace rearward to avoid counterfire. The technology changed from tank guns to wire-guided missiles to fire-and-forget systems, but the tactic of shooting and moving rearward remained constant. Ukrainian forces fighting Russian armor in 2022 used Javelin missiles with exactly these tactics, engaging Russian tanks, then reversing vehicles away before Russian artillery could target the launch position. The specific mechanical challenges of reversing Sherman tanks may be obsolete, but the fundamental insight survives in every military that studies armored warfare. When you cannot match your opponent's capabilities directly, you must fight asymmetrically. When you cannot win fair fights, you must refuse to fight fairly. When your armor is inadequate and your gun is outranged, you must use maneuver, deception, and psychology to create advantages that don't exist on paper. Robert Hoffman survived the war. He came home to Iowa, worked as a diesel mechanic, and never talked much about his time in 3rd Army's 4th Armored Division. When his son asked him once what tank combat was like, Hoffman thought for a long time before answering. He said, "Mostly it was being more scared than you thought possible, and doing the exact opposite of what your fear told you to do." That might be the best description of reverse engagement tactics ever articulated. Everything about reversing toward enemy fire felt wrong, violated instinct, contradicted training, but crews who mastered that counterintuitive maneuver survived encounters that should have killed them. They turned the Sherman's weaknesses into irrelevant factors by refusing to fight in ways that exposed those weaknesses. The historical record shows that American tank losses decreased in units that employed reverse engagement tactics extensively, even as they faced increasingly heavy German armor during late 1944 and early 1945. 4th Armored Division, which pioneered many reverse engagement techniques, suffered approximately 30% lower tank loss rates between October 1944 and February 1945 compared to divisions that relied on conventional forward-oriented tactics. The difference wasn't thicker armor or bigger guns. It was tactics, training, crew coordination, and the willingness to do something that seemed suicidal but actually saved lives. The German military, often considered the gold standard for armored warfare innovation, never developed equivalent reverse engagement doctrines during World War II. German tank design emphasized forward combat capability, aggressive advance, and overwhelming frontal engagements. The idea of deliberately reversing to bait enemy aggression didn't fit German tactical philosophy or training culture. This created a situation where technically superior German tanks were being outmaneuvered by technically inferior American tanks using tactics the Germans hadn't trained to counter. It's a reminder that technical specifications don't determine outcomes in isolation. Tactics, training, adaptability, and the willingness to abandon conventional thinking matter as much or more than armor thickness and gun caliber. The preserved Sherman tanks in museums today don't show the evidence of reverse engagement tactics. There are no plaques explaining that crews learned to fight backward as effectively as forward. The modifications that mattered most, the crew coordination, the verbal command systems, the memorized terrain maps, those weren't physical changes to the vehicle. They were changes to how humans used the vehicle, and those modifications don't survive in steel museums. But walk around a Sherman at the National Armor and Cavalry Museum at Fort Moore, Georgia, and look at the driver's position. Notice there's no rear visibility. Imagine steering that 33-ton vehicle blind in reverse at 12 miles per hour while someone shoots at you with an 88mm gun. Imagine the trust required between commander and driver, the coordination needed between gunner and loader, the psychological control necessary to suppress panic and execute precise maneuvers under fire. Then consider that thousands of young men, many of them barely 20 years old, many with only months of training, learned to do exactly that. They took a tank that was outgunned and out-armored and found ways to make it win by changing the rules of engagement. They survived by being smarter, more flexible, and more willing to innovate than enemies who had every technical advantage. The lesson isn't that American tanks were better. The lesson is that American tank crews made them better through tactics that conventional wisdom said couldn't work. Reversing into enemy fire shouldn't save lives. The mathematics say you're exposing your weakest armor, limiting your speed, reducing your visibility, and increasing mechanical stress. Every factor suggests it should make you more vulnerable, not less. But the mathematics missed something crucial. They missed human psychology. They missed the fact that enemy crews make decisions based on what they see and what they expect. They missed the principle that controlling how your opponent fights matters more than matching his capabilities directly. They missed the reality that tactical innovation can overcome technical inferiority when executed by crews willing to trust their training over their fear. The Sherman tank's greatest weakness wasn't its thin armor or inadequate gun. Its greatest weakness was that it tempted crews to fight conventionally against unconventional odds. The crews who survived weren't the ones who tried to out-armor or outgun German tanks. They were the ones who refused to fight that kind of battle at all. They were the ones who learned that sometimes the best direction to face danger is backward. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.